Well, good morning, everyone. You're listening to the Fuel Growth Podcast. My name is Phil Seaver, and I am the host of the podcast. As ever, I'm joined by my erstwhile co-presenter, Martyn King, who's a managing director of Fuel. Hello, Martyn. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Phil. Very good. I'm very keen to get involved in today's topic. Let me introduce Jocelyn Wood, who I've known for best part of 15 years. We just worked out beforehand. I first got to know Jocelyn in her capacity as a very clever and shrewd marketeer. And she has undertaken a journey over towards mindfulness, which I'm finding fascinating in the round of workplace well-being and the like, and getting the best out of people. Mm-hmm. I'll hand you over to Jocelyn, who will tell us a little bit more about why she got involved in mindfulness.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, cheers. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so I've been in marketing for 30 years, but about 5-6 years ago, discovered mindfulness. I'm a mum. I was a manager, working, juggling everything. I think we can all relate to that as parents. But then my dad moved over. He moved in with us, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And suddenly it threw this whole new dimension about being a carer and juggling that with work and what have you. To help me cope with the stresses and everything that came with it, I was introduced to mindfulness. And I was quite skeptical about whether it would work. Because I thought, well, is this just another fad? Went along to an introductory session and actually found it was brilliant. It was very simple. It was very accessible. It was based on science. I didn't need to believe anything. Could do it whenever I needed to. So then wanted to do more. So went on and did more courses and then wanted to share that with other people because I thought this is really powerful. So went on to qualify as a mindfulness and compassion teacher, which I did about 18 months ago. Sadly, since then, my dad has passed away, but it does mean now that I want to set out on my own and really break into this whole well-being in the workplace, because I think personally for me, that was a really important breakthrough thing. And I want more people to access it. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, I mean, that's a very, it's a perfect introduction to you. I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't say this, but it's clear that we have an expert in the room with us. I like it when we have an expert, at least someone in the room that knows what they're doing, other than you, of course, Martyn. So thank you for joining us today. We've probably got about 20 minutes, that sort of thing. We've got some questions that we want to fire at you. They're not too taxing, okay. But what I want you to do is think of it as a sort of, you're explaining to me about mindfulness. Now, I'm not going to be a judge and jury on this.
Okay.
So a word that you mentioned there that I think is really, really important is you said skeptical. Mm. I think that there is some skepticism around this industry. I don't think there needs to be, if I'm totally honest, because it's fairly simple stuff when it's stripped back down. And it's about looking after yourself. And I think if you look after yourself a little bit better, you perform better. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, mindfulness sounds very complicated, but actually it is just paying attention. So we could all say, well, fine, I can pay attention. We can all do that. But then actually the minute you do that, your mind's going to wander, isn't it? It's going to be distracted. So it's learning, well, how do I pay attention? And we do that through what we call a mindfulness practice. That's what we call the meditation of mindfulness. We use an anchor. So it could be our breath. It could be our body. It could be sounds. But we're working with our thoughts. So people do think it's about clearing your mind, and it's not clearing your mind. It's actually noticing what your mind is doing, what the thought patterns are, and then learning how you work with that. It's very much rooted in science and in research. It's not, I mean, it does go right back to the Buddhism. It's been there for 2,000 years, but I teach secular mindfulness, so you don't need to believe anything to do it. We've purely just taken that paying attention part. But in paying attention, we are actually changing our brains, because our brains are more like plasticine than they are concrete. There's something called neuroplasticity. So when you practice mindfulness and you're working the part of the brain you want to, so say the thinking part of your brain, which is your prefrontal cortex, you're strengthening that. When you're talking to yourself kindly, you're strengthening the parts of the brain that relate to empathy. You're also working with your rest and digest system, not your fight and flight, which we have. That's natural. That's what's kept us safe. But by doing mindfulness, we get more into the calming part of our system and the part of our brain, the amygdala, which you could maybe say is a health and safety officer. And the minute he sees the risk, he wants you to get out of there or fight it. We can actually shrink his influence and keep the communication going with the thinking part of the brain. So it's actually very scientific. It's not skepticism. It's not hopeful or wishful thinking. It's very far removed from that.
Okay, well, let's move on to something that I think might be relevant to some of the people that are either listening or watching today. Let's talk about the role of mindfulness within business or an organization? How important is that, would you say?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. And it's frustrating to me because it isn't covered enough. So that's why I think this is great to get the word out there. I think one, well-being is so important of our staff and employees and our colleagues because life is stressful, life is difficult. We know from surveys that were done last week and Mental Health Awareness Week that 70% of people stated they found anxiety in the workplace. So if you think when you're anxious, you're not giving your best, you're feeling constrained, you're maybe holding back, all sorts of defense mechanisms come into play and you're not your most productive person. With mindfulness, you're looking after the individual and you're looking after the business because the individual, yes, is becoming calmer. They're aware of their thoughts and they're coming out of autopilot. For the business, the benefit is huge because suddenly I can, without increasing my stress levels, and be careful how we say this, but I become more productive, not because I'm working harder or longer hours, just the quality of the time that I'm working is so much better. That means my creativity is better. The way I work with colleagues is better. I'm sort of listening more. I'm doing active listening as opposed to getting carried away with my thoughts or trying to fix things. So for a business, in terms of that, you're looking after your staff, but you're getting a real hard return on investment in terms of productivity, maybe things like reduced sickness days, more creativity. And there's some wonderful case studies out there about how mindfulness can actually help.
I mean, I think something you touched on there, I think fundamentally, if you've got happy team members, you're probably going to have a happier culture within the business. It's probably going to perform better as a business. I think that's, without saying that everything's linked to the, cold commercial reality, that is the truth, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
that is
that is, and we were talking, Martyn, earlier when I arrived, and we were talking about the likes of Cadbury's and what they've done with their business over the years back, in history.
Well, a lot about lots of these things, they aren't just newfangled things. Yeah. Workplace, what you're using your Cadbury example, workplace well-being was at the heart of what they were doing.
Yeah. Look after your staff in your team and they will look after you and your business.
Yeah.
There's something in that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, look, in terms of if you wanted to bring a mindfulness culture into a business, just give us an overview. What sort of thing would we be thinking about? What does that look like?
For me, it would need to be at two levels. And one is obviously very much training your staff and equipping your staff so they understand what mindfulness is, because if we've come to it with misconceptions and thoughts, they are as well. So it's understanding, explaining to people what mindfulness is, but it's also training so that they can learn how to practice and how we actually do a practice, how we work with wandering minds and all those sorts of things. But once you've then got the mindfulness skills within your team, you need to have a mindful culture to actually help that thrive. Because it's one thing saying, well, okay, that's mindfulness, but that's for out there. And here we now need performance, we need hard driven, we need results. And I'm not saying we don't need that, businesses do, but how we go about that, where can we remove unnecessary stress? The way that we go about meetings, can we actually take a breathing space at the beginning? Can we actually practice our active listening? Can we respect people's time off? Can we rearrange our office to minimize distractions? So we can actually nurture those mindfulness skills. So it's at two levels, really. It's at the organizational level and at the individual level.
Okay. I'm kind of loath to touch on this one because I think it's such a positive thing to do.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic about the situation. Let's say I'm running a business. I've got a team of 20 people. What sort of challenges am I going to face if I decide that, today I'm going to bring in a mindfulness culture?
Yeah.
I mean, what are the challenges for a business these days?
I think the first one is going to be skepticism, because there will be people coming along that sort of think, I'm not entirely sure this is going to work, or it's not going to work for me, or I don't have the time. So I would say, maybe work with it in a little way first, maybe start with your senior management team so that they can learn about it, embody it, lead it, show that they are being more attentive, that they're being more calm, or maybe you could specialize in a particular team and then ripple away from that. You need to think why you're doing it, what your objectives are. Are we doing it to start to win over the management team, which is what Capital One did. They sort of had an employee who championed it, and then they did introductory sessions and it kind of grew from there. And now they're recognized as a very strong mindfulness culture. But you need to think why you're doing it, the costs associated with it, just as you would with any other strategy. Who's going to own it? What are the objectives? How are we going to monitor this? How do we know that we are a mindful business? What measures do we want to look at? And that will then create the openness to talk about it. And I think so often mental health isn't spoken about, or anxiety, there's so much stigma attached. I think with mindfulness, it opens up the discussion. It's not something that you access when you're broken. You can access it when you're well. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, as you asked that question, I did think, well, hang on, how would we approach it? So,
well, that was going to be my question, Martyn.
Yeah.
What is it that you guys, I don't want to put you on the spot here. What is it you guys are doing at Fuel in line with this? Are you on board with this, or?
Yeah. So, I'll get to that, because Jocelyn and I have had a couple of conversations about how we bring that into Fuel. So we haven't started that process just yet, but I suppose the thought that sort of occurred to me was around sort of skepticism and how you start to bring that into the organization.
Yeah,
we're easier to get on board, if you like, because we do have a lot of care in our workforce and everything else. So to a certain extent, you're pushing on an open door a little bit. And obviously doing our 4-day week, we've just actually got some stuff back in terms of client feedback, which talks about the quality of our work and everything else. Now, actually, the quality of our work is either perceived to be the same or even better by, I think I'm right in saying, 91% of respondents said that. So for me, what I'm looking at is going, well, a couple of things. One, still really shocked at 70% of people are still suffering anxiety in the workplace. So that's still a colossal number. But then it's coming back to our team. So again, fuel and growth for our own team, and sort of thinking, well, hang on, what tools can we equip people with to be able to perform at their best? So work-life balance, we're on that one, if you like. But being super focused and come back to what you said, creative in the moment, that's what we get paid for. Massively important.
Yeah, look, I mean, you're right about the pushing on the open door thing, because I've known you and Steve for 10 years now, and I know pretty much your team here, and I get the impression that if anyone was struggling in any way, you are probably two of the most approachable people that I know in business. So it's not as if that's going to be hard, but I guess it's about formalizing that or creating an environment that makes it easy for people to say, listen, I'm struggling and I need a hand, sort of thing. So rather than the old way, I guess I grew up in, which was like, if you didn't perform, you were just worried in case you lost your job, and that was your motivation. That's a horrible existence to have for anyone in a job. So, but no, it's interesting you say, and you touched on the 4-day week. Of course, that's got to have had a major impact on the mindfulness of your staff, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of work-life balance and ability to do the work. So yeah, look, anything that can give us an edge. So I'm being a little bit commercial.
Yeah, I think you got to be.
Is it's got to be there. Anything that improves our ability to do the work. So that's fine.
Well, just on that, because you touched on something there, and I'm going to fire this back to Jocelyn. I mean, what sort of rewards are there to be had for businesses? And I don't want to make it about commercial reality, but if you're a business, what are the rewards that are there if you adopted a mindfulness culture?
They're huge. I mean, one that we were talking about at the wellbeing breakfast that we did was very much about staff retention and staff recruitment, is that people are finding it very difficult to fill vacancies at the moment. So people are being a little bit more choosy about where they work. So if you as an employer can show that you've got wellbeing, that you're looking after your staff, then you will attract higher caliber people, and people are more likely to stay with you because they're being looked after. So if you think of all those recruitment costs that are involved, for mindfulness, and you're going to get a return on that. Similarly, if you're looking at staff cover or absences, a lot of absence due to stress. So if we can manage our stress better, then you're going to have less absence. And I know in things, say like the veterinary profession, where your staff cover costs are quite huge to get temporary staff to cover that, they've actually modelled the return, believe it or not, it was 3,000%, that for what they invested in mindfulness, what they actually then saved on temporary recruitment costs to cover the veterinary, the surgeons and nurses, what have you, is absolutely huge. So that's a very hard return sort of there. But then you have got the productivity. And I'm sort of very interested with Martyn because I love the fact they did a 4-day week. To someone who's into well-being, that you've actually made that decision in a business and support that to happen is amazing. But listening to Martyn, you know, how he did it, the communication needed, the buddying system. And in fact, you're doing a 4-day week, but you're pretty much still doing full-time hours in those 4 days,
Correct.
from what I can see. And the standards haven't slipped. They're still accessible to their clients. So that's a lot of soft skills with the staff that they need, and that adaptability, that when they're in the office, they're being really productive, that when they're buddying and they're talking to each other, that communication must be critical. And we can't waste time in the creativity process. You know, we want to be on the nail pretty quickly. So I think things like mindfulness for, say, a creative agency like Fuel, and again, there's been studies done, is absolutely huge. And then in the legal profession, there's a lot of stress, there's sleepless nights, there's people not being able to turn off from work when they go home. Mindfulness has been able to help people with their sleep, and then they engage in their jobs more. When they're at work, they're more productive and the quality of their work's higher. And as I say, with no cost, there's no stress cost to the individual. The stress levels are actually going down, but you're getting more out of people, and they're feeling more fulfilled and more valued and feeling better within themselves. So,
well, look, one thing I want to do sort of as we approach the end here, but I want you to think of some tips that you could give to an organisation if they were interested in this as sort of first stage. But before I do, I just want to pick up something from Martyn there. This buddying system that you have at Fuel, how come no one's ever buddied me? I'm hurt by it, I have to say. I'm not worthy of a buddy? I'm genuinely hurt. Right, let's move back on to Jocelyn. You don't have to answer that, Martyn. I'm not strictly an employee, I have to say. But yeah, I'm hurt. I'm very hurt.
I'll find you a buddy. I'll find you a
Jocelyn, give us some tips, please.
I'll be your friend.
Can you give us some tips?
I would say to an organisation, well, to find out more about it and then have tasters, try mindfulness. The best way to find out about it is to actually do a little practice, to actually see what it's like. If you're feeling self-conscious, whatever, it's all actually part of the practice. It's all working with your thoughts, but it's actually understanding more about it. And then just gently, maybe start with a little taster, maybe start with an introductory session. Think about how you work with your colleagues, you know, who's going to champion it? What budget have you got? What is your well-being strategy? There is something called the Mindful Business Charter, which kind of also lays out what businesses can look at. So that does look at like meeting etiquette or email etiquette or how you delegate things. So it's sort of looking at the workplace in a mindful way and thinking, well, how can we reduce the stress? But I think it's very much a taster and introductory training sessions. Then how do you support your staff once they've got these skills? Because we all know, same with dieting, I lose the weight, go back to eating the chocolate, weight goes back on. Mindfulness is the same. If we don't keep practicing it, we lose that agility. So having a support mechanism in place afterwards to keep it going, to keep it alive is really very important.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I remember when I first started working, there was that culture of you shouldn't be the first person to leave the office at the end of the day.
Yes.
And equally, you know, people were doing, an email comes in and everyone's sort of sending emails at like 10 o'clock at night.
Yes.
And now we're starting to see things where bosses are saying to people, go home. You've got families to go to. You've got homes and lives to live.
Absolutely.
Or don't send emails after 6 o'clock because it's not actually the good look that you think it is. And I think it's about looking after staff.
It is very much so. And looking after yourself. And actually part of the Mindful Business Charter is exactly that your email footage, you put what your working hours are, when you can be contacted. And if you are emailing out of work, that you will say if it needs to be responded to out of work or whether it can actually wait to the next day. There's just little things like that. It's just courtesy and respect, which are common sense, but it's actually formalizing it really.
But again, I mean, you say about common sense, but the reality of the situation is that common sense has over the years gone out of the window.
Has gone out of the window.
And we have stopped looking after our team.
We have.
And my fear is that if you stop looking after your team, you don't genuinely have a business.
No.
Or you won't do soon. That's
no,
for sure.
No.
Well, look, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's been a hugely interesting chat. It's very much been a top level chat because you're talking to me, and I think it's got to be simple. But I think, you know, if people have got an opportunity to do something like this and look after their team in this way, it's fundamentally a good thing. A, because it's good for them, and that is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
And B, because it's really good for the business as well.
Absolutely.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, for
so,
sure.
Jocelyn, thank you very much for coming in today. who knows, there may be a part 2 to this where we have a deeper dive into this at some point. But thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your time and effort. And of course, Martyn, thank you as well for allowing us to do this podcast here in your home.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
a lot,
me.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.